The rain that night was relentless, a pounding torrent that masked the rustling of leaves and the creaks of old wood in the house. I sat curled on the sofa, staring at the clock, each tick feeling like a hammer blow in the silence. Tom stood at the window, shoulders rigid, eyes trained on the woods that loomed beyond our yard. The search for little Johnny Lanes had consumed him, but whatever he found out there changed him in a way I couldn't touch or understand. Tom was the kind of man who could make anyone laugh, even on the grimmest of days. I fell in love with that unwavering steadiness, the warmth in his voice as he recounted stories about the town over our morning coffee. But now that voice was muted, dulled, as if something had scraped away the man I knew and left behind a hollow shell. The night he came home from the woods, his clothes were caked in mud, and something that smelled like rusted iron. He didn't say a word as he trudged past me, tracking damp earth across the floor. I reached for him, fingertips brushing his arm, but he recoiled, eyes flicking to mine with an unreadable expression. I told myself it was exhaustion. I convinced myself that whatever he'd seen that night had fractured his spirit. The woods held secrets I knew that much from the stories passed down in hushed tones at town gatherings. The days blurred together. Tom's eyes, once so familiar and kind, were now distant, glassy with something deeper than fatigue. He sat for hours at the edge of our bed, head bowed, fingers clenched as if trying to keep them from shaking. When I asked him, pleaded with him to tell me what he'd seen out there, he would only look up, a shadow crossing his face before he whispered, "I don't know, Mary. I don't remember." The whispers started not long after. Late at night, when the wind died down and the world outside lay shrouded in silence, I'd hear it, a low, guttural murmur that prickled my skin. I'd sit up in bed, holding my breath, straining to make sense of the words that seemed to seep from the walls. Once, I found Tom standing at the window, mouth moving in time with the whispers, though no sound came out. His reflection caught in the glass looked wrong, somehow stretched and pale. And then there was Max, our golden retriever, who had loved Tom more than anyone. He began avoiding him, tail tucked, ears flat. He'd skitter from the room if Tom so much as entered, a low whine vibrating in his throat. I asked Tom what was wrong, why Max seemed afraid. He only shrugged, his mouth curving in a way that made my skin crawl, a semblance of a smile that didn't touch his eyes. I did know them. Tales of people who'd wandered too far, only to return hollow-eyed, speaking to shadows, hearing things in the wind. There were old stories about the Watcher's spirit said to inhabit the forest, taking root in the minds of those who trespassed where they shouldn't. But I shook my head, refusing to believe it could be true. They said things would go back to normal in time. Desperate for answers, I buried myself in the town's archives, fingers tracing faded ink and brittle paper. I read about a man, Thomas Hollis, who'd once searched those same woods for his missing son. He'd come back a different man, they said, eyes void of light, speaking in fragmented whispers. His family had tried to save him, but one by one, they vanished. The final entry in a journal, hastily scribbled, spoke of shadows moving when they shouldn't. And a voice that imitated their father's, calling them by name. I turned the page, breath held tight in my chest, only to find the next few sheets torn out, jagged edges marking where someone had tried to erase the rest of the tale. Frustration clawed at me as I flipped through the archives, realizing entire sections were missing or redacted. The few records that remained hinted at something worse than the town's whispered folklore, a concerted effort to hide the truth. I pulled down an old ledger, its leather binding cracked with age. Tucked between the pages was a letter, brittle and yellowed, marked with the seal of the town council. My fingers trembled as I read. "We cannot allow this madness to tarnish the town's reputation. The Hollis incident was an unfortunate tragedy, but to acknowledge anything more would cast a shadow over Fair Hollow. Let the woods keep their secrets." A sick realization coiled in my gut. They had buried the truth to protect their name, to maintain the veneer of a quaint town untroubled by the kind of stories that sent shivers down the spine. They had let the warnings fade into myth, dismissed as the ramblings of fearful old-timers and superstitious farmers. Whatever had happened to Thomas Hollis had been scrubbed from memory, locked away so deep that even the whispers had grown faint. The memory of Tom standing at the window, silent and rigid, flooded back to me, sending a shiver up my spine. I had to know. I couldn't let the uncertainty gnaw at me any longer. Before the sun rose, I grabbed the lantern and ventured into the woods, cold dew soaking through my boots. The trees towered, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me until every rustle of leaves seemed magnified. Deeper and deeper I went, heart pounding, eyes searching for any sign. Then I saw a patch of disturbed earth, half hidden under a snarl of roots. I dropped to my knees, hands trembling as I brushed away the dirt. My fingers hit something hard and cold, a badge, Tom's badge. Panic bubbled in my chest, and I kept digging until the lantern's light fell on his face, lifeless and pale, eyes wide and empty. The realization struck with a force that left me gasping. Mary, a voice called from behind, smooth and low. My heart seized as I turned, lantern shaking in my grip. There, just beyond the reach of the light, stood Tom, or something wearing his shape. His mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too far, eyes gleaming like wet stones. "Where were you?" he asked, each word carefully placed, as if rehearsed. My knees buckled, and the air around me seemed to thrum with an unseen pulse. My mind struggled for an explanation. Was this the Watcher, twisting his voice, making him something else? The silence stretched, filled only by my ragged breaths, and the echo of a grin that held no warmth. A strangled sob escaped me, grief mixing with fury as I clenched my fists. This mimic had taken Tom, hollowed him out, left his body to rot, while it played at being my husband. My knees threatened to give way under the weight of my horror, but something deep within held firm, an anger igniting that burned hotter than my terror. But it wasn't done. The mimic lunged forward, its hand latching onto my wrist with a grip like iron. I felt its cold fingers dig into my skin, and a wave of nausea washed over me as its face twisted, cycling through Tom's expression of love, sorrow, fury, each one a hollow, mocking replica. With a desperate cry, I tore my wrist from its grip and scrambled for the broken shards of the lantern. I seized a jagged piece of glass, blood dripping as I held it tightly, my pulse a roar in my ears. The mimic advanced again, slower now, weakened but undeterred, its eyes glinting with something feral. "You think you can win?" it whispered. The voice layered, shifting through tones, as if a dozen voices spoke at once. "You'll die here, Mary." Just like he did, a surge of rage coursed through me. I would not let this thing have the last word. I waited until it was close, then drove the shard deep into its chest, twisting it with all the strength I had. It screamed again, louder this time, the sound reverberating through the clearing like a death knell. The creature staggered back, dark liquid oozing from the wound, its form flickering and fracturing like the reflection of a nightmare in a broken mirror. I watched, breath caught, as it crumpled to its knees, its body convulsing and twisting between faces I recognized from town neighbors, strangers, even familiar friends. One by one, each visage slipped across its twisted features before it settled back to Tom's face, his eyes wide with a glint of something that looked almost like fear. A sudden calm washed over me as I knelt close, the jagged shard still tight in my hand. I leaned in, my voice a low, steady fury. "You took him from me. Now you'll never take anyone else." With a final, deliberate twist of the glass shard, I drove it deeper. The mimic's body spasmed, twisting one last time as a shriek, hollow and fading, tore through the clearing. And then, with a final shudder, it went still. Its face collapsed inward, losing all semblance of Tom or anyone else, becoming nothing more than a shadow pooling on the forest floor, seeping into the earth like a poison being drained. I stumbled back, barely able to breathe, the fractured lantern casting its weak, trembling light over the silent clearing. For the first time, the forest was quiet, a deep, settling stillness that felt like an exhalation of relief. The mimic was gone, and with it, whatever darkness it had carried into the heart of these woods. I sank to my knees, my chest heaving as grief rose like a tide, raw and unrelenting, yet mixed with a fierce, bitter satisfaction. Tom was gone. That truth echoed through me, cold and final, but I'd avenged him. I'd put an end to the mimic's cruel games, ended the lie that had stolen his life. As the weight of that moment pressed down, I realized that I had not only saved myself but stopped the creature from claiming anyone else who wandered too far into the shadows. I rose slowly, blood-streaked and trembling, the silent woods stretching out around me, no longer haunted by the mimic's presence. And as I turned away from the clearing, carrying only the memory of Tom with me, I knew that the monster was gone, leaving only shadows in the forest that would never claim another soul.